18 months ago, my husband Michael cried over my coffin, promising to love me forever. My best friend Jessica held his hand, whispering comfort as they lowered me into the ground. The whole town of Riverside watched as rain mixed with their tears, believing they were witnessing the most tragic love story our community had ever seen. But last Tuesday, I walked into our old coffee shop and saw them celebrating their first wedding anniversary. Not mourning my death, not visiting my grave, celebrating their marriage that happened exactly 6 months after my funeral. The wedding ring on Jessica's finger? It was mine. The house they were toasting? Also mine. The insurance money they used for their honeymoon? Oh, you can guess where that came from. Problem is, I wasn't actually dead. I had been in a medical facility recovering from injuries that were supposed to kill me, with no memory of who. I was for over a year. When I finally remembered everything and came home, I discovered that my death had been declared, my assets distributed, and my entire life had been stolen by the two people I trusted most. But here's the thing about being declared legally dead when you're actually alive. You get to watch people's true colors emerge when they think you can't see them anymore. And what I saw was a conspiracy so calculated, so heartless, that it made me realize my accident might not have been an accident at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was Michael's voice on the phone, urgent and panicked. "Sarah, you have to come get me right now. My car broke down on Highway 91, and there's this huge storm coming. I'm stranded at the Morrison exit." I remember grabbing my keys, worry flooding through me as I listened to the rain pounding against our kitchen windows. Michael had been working, late again showing houses to potential buyers, even on a Thursday night. As a real estate agent, he always said the best deals happened when other agents had given up for the day. "Stay put, honey. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I had told him, already pulling on my jacket. Our house on Maple Street was only 15 minutes from the Morrison exit on a normal day. But the October storm was making visibility terrible. Jessica had been over that evening, helping me plan the surprise birthday party we were throwing for Michael's 30th. She looked up from the guest list we'd been working on, concern creasing her features. "Sarah, maybe you should wait for the storm to pass. These roads get dangerous when they're wet." But I was already heading for the door. Michael was my husband of 3 years, and he needed me. He's been working so hard lately trying to close that big commercial deal. I can't leave him stranded in this weather. Jessica followed me to the entryway, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "At least text me when you get there safely, promise me." I hugged my best friend since college, breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume. From our days sharing a tiny dorm room at UC Riverside to standing as each other's maid of honor at our respective weddings. Well, she had been maid of honor at mine. Her wedding to David had been called off 2 months before the ceremony when she discovered he'd been cheating. I promise. Keep working on that guest list. Michael's going to be so surprised when he sees everyone we've managed to gather for Saturday. The drive started normally enough. I knew these roads like the back of my hand, having grown up in Riverside, and rarely leaving, except for college. My grandmother's house, which had become our house when she passed 2 years earlier, was perfectly positioned between downtown and the highway. But as I drove further from the city center, the storm intensified. Rain hammered my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The road ahead became a blur of reflected streetlights and the occasional red glow of taillights from other brave souls venturing out in the weather. I called Michael to let him know I was getting close, but his phone went straight to voicemail. That should have been my first warning sign. I pressed on, assuming his phone had died or lost signal in the storm. The Morrison exit was just ahead. I could see a few cars parked under the overpass where people sometimes waited out bad weather. As I took the exit ramp, I squinted through the rain, looking for Michael's silver sedan. That's when I saw the headlights. They were coming straight at me, impossibly bright and moving fast. Too fast for someone taking the exit ramp safely. I jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, but the wet asphalt offered no grip. My car spun, the world becoming a nauseating blur of lights and rain and the horrible sound of metal against concrete. The impact was like being hit by lightning and thunder simultaneously. Every bone in my body seemed to vibrate with the shock. Then there was nothing but darkness and the distant sound of sirens mixing with the storm. What I didn't know then was that the accident scene would be chaos. First responders found my car wrapped around a concrete pillar, the other vehicle nowhere to be seen. With the storm and poor visibility, witness accounts were contradictory. Some said they saw another car. Others insisted I had simply lost control in the rain. What I also didn't know was that Jessica arrived at the hospital before the ambulance did. As a registered nurse at Riverside General, she had connections, access, and most importantly, the knowledge to navigate the medical system in ways that an ordinary person couldn't. When the paramedics radioed ahead that they were bringing in a critical car accident victim, Jessica was already positioning herself to be involved in my care. The head trauma was severe. Emergency surgery was required immediately, and the prognosis was uncertain. During those crucial first hours when my life hung in the balance, Jessica was there, not as my friend, but as a medical professional with access to my chart, my prognosis, and the doctors making life and death decisions about my treatment. Michael arrived 3 hours later, soaking wet and frantic. He burst into the waiting room where Jessica was sitting. Her scrubs wrinkled from the long shift she'd supposedly been working when I had my accident. "How is she?" he pleaded, grabbing Jessica's hands. But here's what I learned much later. During my slow recovery in a specialized facility 200 miles away, where I was transferred after the initial surgery, Michael hadn't been stranded on Highway 91 that night. His car wasn't broken down. The phone call that sent me driving into the storm had been a lie. Jessica's shift at the hospital hadn't started until the next morning. She wasn't supposed to be there when the ambulance arrived, yet somehow she was. And the guest list we'd been working on for Michael's surprise birthday party? When I eventually recovered enough memory to ask about it, I discovered that the party had been canceled. It's not postponed out of respect for my condition, but canceled because, according to Michael and Jessica, I had never been planning one in the first place. But in those first critical days after the accident, none of this was apparent to the doctors fighting to save my life, or to the community that rallied around Michael in his time of grief. Robbed! My sister Amanda flew in from Seattle immediately, staying by my bedside during the coma that followed the surgery. She later told me about Michael's vigil, how he would sit beside my bed for hours, holding my hand and talking to me as if I could hear every word. "He was devastated, Sarah," Amanda said during one of our phone calls, after my memory started returning. "I've never seen a man so broken. Kept saying it should have been him, that he never should have asked you to drive in that storm." Amanda didn't know what none of us knew, was that the person sitting beside my hospital bed wasn't a grieving husband. He was someone calculating exactly how long he could wait before my condition would be declared hopeless. Jessica, with her medical knowledge, would have known that severe head trauma cases like mine could go either way. Recovery was possible, but it could take months or even years. And during that time, with me unable to communicate or make decisions, Michael would have legal authority over my medical care and eventually my estate. The decision to transfer me to Harbor View Rehabilitation Center came 3 weeks after the accident. My condition had stabilized, but I remained unresponsive. The doctors at Riverside General recommended the specialized facility. It's known for its work with traumatic brain injury patients. It was expensive, but my insurance would cover it, and my family had resources. Michael signed the transfer papers with what everyone believed was reluctant acceptance of a difficult reality. The love of his life would need long-term care, and he was committed to ensuring I received the best treatment available no matter how long it took. Harbor View was in Monterey, a beautiful coastal town where the sound of waves and fresh ocean air were supposed to aid in healing. It was also far enough from Riverside that visitors would need to make a significant effort to see patients regularly. Amanda visited every other weekend for the first 2 months, making the 4-hour drive despite her demanding job as a software engineer. Michael came less frequently, citing work obligations and the emotional difficulty of seeing me in such a state. Jessica never visited at all. 6 months after my transfer to Harbor View, something changed in the frequency and tone of communications from home. Amanda's visits became more sporadic as Michael assured her that he was in constant contact with my doctors and that there had been no change in my condition. Phone calls from friends and extended family tapered off as Michael, speaking as my husband and medical proxy, updated them on my continued unresponsiveness and suggested that maintaining hope was becoming cruel to everyone involved. What was actually happening during those months was that I was slowly, gradually beginning to respond to treatment. The brain is a mysterious organ, and traumatic injury recovery doesn't follow predictable timelines. While my eyes remained closed, and I couldn't speak or move purposefully, my brain activity was increasing. The doctors at Harborview were cautiously optimistic, but they were also experienced enough not to make promises about outcomes that remained uncertain. Michael received regular updates on my condition as my designated emergency contact and medical proxy. But somewhere along the way, those updates stopped being shared with my sister or anyone else in my family. Michael became the sole conduit of information about my health, and the information he chose to share became increasingly pessimistic. 8 months after the accident, Amanda received a call that changed everything. Michael's voice was heavy, with grief and exhaustion as he explained that my doctors had recommended transitioning to palliative care. My brain activity had flatlined, he said. Specialists agreed that further treatment would only prolong suffering without any realistic hope of recovery. "I know this isn't what Sarah would want," he told my sister through tears that sounded completely genuine. She always said she never wanted to be kept alive by machines if there was no chance of a meaningful recovery. Amanda was devastated, but not surprised. 8 months of visiting a sister who showed no signs of awareness had prepared her for this possibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She trusted Michael's judgment and his love for me. If the doctors truly believed there was no hope, then perhaps it was time to let me go peacefully. What Amanda didn't know was that Harborview had never recommended palliative care. In fact, they had just begun seeing the first signs that I might be emerging from the deep unconsciousness that had persisted since the accident. My responses to stimuli were becoming more consistent, and there were patterns in my brain activity that suggested the possibility of cognitive recovery. But Michael never shared this information with my family. Instead, he began the process of having me declared legally dead due to medical futility. The paperwork was complex, requiring multiple medical opinions and legal documentation. But Michael navigated it with help from a lawyer who specialized in end-of-life decisions. Jessica assisted by providing medical terminology and documentation that supported the case for declaring my condition irreversible. Her position at Riverside General gave her credibility. When she spoke to the legal team about my prognosis and the likelihood of recovery from such severe trauma, 10 months after my accident, Sarah Chen was declared legally deceased due to catastrophic brain injury with no possibility of recovery. The death certificate was filed, insurance claims were submitted, and funeral arrangements were made. The service was beautiful, according to everyone who attended. Michael had chosen a casket that reflected my personality, flowers that included all my favorites, and music that captured the joy I had brought to the lives of people who loved me. Jessica delivered a eulogy about our friendship that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. Amanda spoke about growing up with a sister who always believed the best about people, who trusted deeply and loved unconditionally. She talked about how proud she was of the marriage Michael and I had built, and how grateful she felt that I had found someone who loved me as completely as Michael did. My empty casket was lowered into the ground at Sunset Memorial Gardens on a gray November morning. Michael threw the first handful of dirt, followed by Jessica, then Amanda, and then a long line of friends, neighbors and colleagues who had come to say goodbye to someone they believed had been taken far too soon. But 200 miles away, in a rehabilitation facility overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Sarah Chen was beginning to wake up. Consciousness returned to me like sunrise breaking, through fog, slow and disorienting. For weeks I drifted between awareness and darkness, catching fragments of conversations, feeling the warmth of sunlight through windows, hearing the distant crash of ocean waves that seemed to call me back to the world of the living. Dr. Martinez, MY neurologist at Harborview, later explained that my type of recovery was rare but not unprecedented. The brain, he said, sometimes needs to rebuild pathways around damaged areas, creating new connections that allow consciousness to gradually reassemble itself. That's why traumatic brain injury recovery can't be predicted with certainty, and why patience is crucial even when hope seems lost. The first coherent thought I remember having was wondering why everything smelled like salt air instead of the vanilla candles I always kept burning at home. The second was confusion about why my body felt so weak, as if I hadn't moved in months. The third was a desperate need to find Michael and let him know I was okay. Memory returned in pieces like a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table. I remembered the storm, the phone call, the drive toward Highway 91. I remembered the headlights coming straight at me and the sickening moment when I realized I couldn't avoid the collision. But everything after that was blank until I found myself in a hospital bed, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling while a kind nurse named Maria explained that I was in Monterey and that I'd been unconscious for over a year. "Your husband will be so relieved," Maria said, tears in her eyes as she held my hand. "We've been calling him every few weeks with updates, but it's been so hard to give him any hope. Dr. Martinez said this might happen. But after so many months, we were all starting to worry." The confusion was overwhelming. A year. How could I have lost an entire year of my life? And why was I in Monterey when the accident happened in Riverside? Maria patiently explained about the transfer, about the specialized care I'd needed, about how my family had made the difficult decision to bring me here for the best possible treatment. "Where's Michael now?" I asked, my voice rough from months of disuse. "Can you call him?" Maria's expression grew gentle but puzzled. "Honey, we've been calling the number we have on file, but it's been disconnected for months. Your husband stopped responding to our calls around Christmas," he assumed. Sometimes families need space when recovery takes this long. The first seed of doubt was planted in that moment, though I refused to let it grow. Michael wouldn't abandon me. He loved me. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd changed his number due to too many painful calls from the hospital. Maybe he'd moved and forgotten to update his contact information. Maybe the grief had become too much, and he needed some distance to cope. Dr. Martinez arrived an hour later. A tall man with kind eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that probably served him well when delivering difficult news to families. Was clearly thrilled by my recovery, calling it remarkable and ordering a battery of tests to assess my cognitive function and physical capabilities. "Your motor skills will need significant rehabilitation," he explained, after reviewing the results. 18 months of immobility has weakened your muscles considerably. But cognitively, you're performing better than we dared hope. Your memory seems largely intact, though you may continue to recover details gradually over the coming weeks. I asked him about Michael, about my family, about why no one seemed to know I was awake. Dr. Martinez's expression grew troubled as he consulted my chart. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you something important. Do you have any family members, other than your husband? A sister, perhaps? Or parents? My sister Amanda lives in Seattle. My parents passed away when I was in college. But Amanda and I are very close. She would want to know I'm okay." Dr. Martinez made notes, his frown deepening. "I'm going to have our social services coordinator look into this. It's unusual for a patient to be without any family contact for so long, especially when recovery begins. We'll get this sorted out." Over the next few days, as I worked with physical therapists to regain basic mobility and occupational therapists to rebuild my strength, pieces of information began filtering back to me that made no sense. The social services coordinator, Mrs. Chen, discovered that the phone number on file for Michael had indeed been disconnected. But more troubling was that the address listed for our home was showing as occupied by different residents. This sometimes happens when families move during a long-term care situation, Mrs. Chen explained carefully. People sometimes need to downsize or relocate for financial reasons when dealing with extensive medical bills. But I knew our financial situation. My grandmother had left the house completely paid off, and we had excellent insurance through my job at the marketing firm. There was no reason Michael would need to sell our home, especially since it held so much sentimental value for both of us. The marketing firm was my next concern. I'd been a senior account manager there, and my colleagues were like a second family. Surely they would have stayed in touch with Michael during my recovery, would have sent cards or flowers or offered support. When Mrs. Chen called Davidson Marketing on my behalf, she discovered that my employment had been terminated due to extended absence, which was standard policy. But when she asked to speak to my former supervisor about contacting my husband, she was told something that made my blood run cold. "They said your husband came in about a year ago with your death certificate," Mrs. Chen reported gently. "He collected your final paycheck and personal belongings. The company sent flowers to your funeral, death certificate, funeral." The words didn't make sense. I was alive, sitting in a rehabilitation center, learning to walk again. How could what? There had been a death certificate? Mrs. Chen immediately contacted the State Vital Records Office. And what she discovered launched an investigation that would unravel everything I thought I knew about the past 18 months. According to official records, Sarah Chen Thompson had died 13 months earlier from complications related to traumatic brain injury. A death certificate had been filed, signed by Dr. Williams at Riverside General, stating that I had succumbed to my injuries after a prolonged period of unsuccessful treatment. The problem was that Dr. Williams had never declared me dead. When investigators contacted him, he was shocked to learn that a death certificate bearing his signature existed. He had indeed treated me in the emergency room the night of my accident, and he had authorized my transfer to Harbor View. But he had never been contacted about my death or asked to sign any such documentation. The signature on the death certificate was a forgery. As the investigation expanded, more disturbing facts emerged. My life insurance policy had been claimed successfully, with the full $500,000 benefit paid out to Michael as my beneficiary. Our house had been sold 8 months after my supposed death, with Michael signing all the paperwork as my surviving spouse. My investment accounts had been liquidated, my savings accounts emptied, and even my grandmother's jewelry collection had been sold through an estate auction. Amanda, my sister, had been notified of my death by Michael personally. He had called her in tears, explaining that I had finally succumbed to my injuries and that the doctors agreed it was a blessing since I would never have recovered meaningful brain function. He had arranged the funeral, he said, for just 2 weeks later. Knowing that I would have wanted a simple ceremony without prolonged suffering for those who loved me, Amanda had flown down for the funeral, devastated by the loss of her only remaining family member. She told investigators that Michael had been inconsolable, barely able to speak during the ceremony. Jessica had been his primary support, helping coordinate the reception and managing the guests, while Michael grieved. The funeral had been beautiful, Amanda remembered. Michael had chosen everything with such care, selecting flowers and music that perfectly captured my personality. Jessica had given a moving eulogy about our friendship, and Michael had been to overcome with emotion to speak, though he had written a letter that Jessica read on his behalf. But here's what Amanda didn't know. The letter Jessica Reed hadn't been written by Michael Elst. It had been written by Jessica herself, crafted to sound like something a grieving husband would say, while subtly establishing details that would support their story. References to conversations Michael and I had supposedly had about end-of-life wishes, and mentions of how peaceful I had looked in my final days. Descriptions of last words I had allegedly spoken before slipping into the coma that preceded my death. All lies. Carefully constructed to build a narrative that would prevent anyone from questioning the circumstances of my death or the speed with which Michael had moved to settle my estate. The investigation also revealed that Jessica had been instrumental in providing medical documentation to support the death certificate. As a registered nurse familiar with traumatic brain injury cases, she had been able to describe my supposed decline in medical terms that sounded authentic to the lawyers and insurance investigators who reviewed the claim. She had provided detailed reports about my neurological deterioration, complete with medical terminology and timeline documentation that painted a picture of inevitable decline following initial stabilization. According to her reports, I had developed complications including brain swelling, infection, and ultimately complete loss of brainstem function. None of it was true, but it was written by someone with enough medical knowledge to make it convincing to people who weren't directly involved in my care. The most damning discovery came when investigators examined the timeline of events more carefully. Michael had filed for the death certificate exactly 1 day after the legal minimum time period required for declaring someone deceased due to medical futility. He had contacted the insurance company within a week of the certificate being issued. The house had been listed for sale within a month. This wasn't the behavior of a grieving widower slowly coming to terms with loss. This was the behavior of someone executing a carefully planned timeline. When investigators interviewed the funeral home director, they learned that Michael had specifically requested a closed casket service, citing the traumatic nature of my injuries and his desire to let people remember me as I was. The casket had been expensive, solid mahogany with brass fittings. Exactly the sort of thing a loving husband would choose for his wife's final resting place, except that the casket was empty. The funeral home had been told that my body was being cremated privately before the service, and that the ashes would be interred during the burial ceremony. Michael had provided documentation showing that the cremation had been completed at a facility in Los Angeles, and he had presented an urn that he said contained my remains. When investigators tracked down the Los Angeles crematorium, they discovered that no Sarah Thompson had ever been cremated there. The documentation Michael had provided was fabricated, and the urn that had been buried in my grave contained nothing but sand and stones. My empty grave at Sunset Memorial Gardens became a crime scene. Workers carefully exhumed the casket while investigators documented everything, searching for any evidence that might explain how this elaborate deception had been carried out. What they found was a burial vault containing an expensive casket filled with weights to simulate the presence of a body. The urn that Michael had tearfully placed inside during the burial ceremony contained sand from a construction site and rocks that appeared to have been collected from the cemetery grounds. The groundskeeper remembered Michael visiting the grave site frequently in the weeks following the burial, always accompanied by Jessica. They would bring flowers, spend long periods in apparent grief, and sometimes other mourners would join them for impromptu memorial gatherings. To everyone who witnessed these visits, Michael appeared to be a devoted widower, keeping his wife's memory alive. But investigators realized that these visits served another purpose. They established Michael's public presence as a grieving husband, creating witnesses who would remember his apparent devastation and ongoing love for his deceased wife. If anyone ever questioned the circumstances of my death, dozens of people could testify to seeing Michael's continued grief and devotion. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned conspiracy that had been months in the making. Financial records showed that Michael had been researching life insurance policies and legal procedures for declaring someone dead due to medical reasons well before my accident. Jessica's computer showed internet searches for information about traumatic brain injury recovery timelines, legal requirements for death certificates, and procedures for transferring property after a spouse's death. These searches dated back to several weeks before my accident, suggesting that the plan had been in development for some time. The most chilling discovery was a series of text messages between Michael and Jessica from the week before my accident. They had been deleted from their phones, but investigators recovered them from cellular provider records. "Everything is ready for Thursday night," Michael had written. "Make sure you're working when it happens. I'll be there," Jessica had replied. "Remember, head trauma cases are unpredictable, so people never wake up, and some people do," Michael had responded. "That's why we need to be prepared for both possibilities." When confronted with this evidence, both Michael and Jessica initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming that the messages were taken out of context and that their actions had been motivated by grief and confusion rather than criminal intent. They maintained that they had genuinely believed I was dying and that they had simply made mistakes in their handling of the legal and medical documentation. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged death certificate, the fabricated medical reports, the staged funeral, the fraudulent insurance claim, the systematic liquidation of my assets, all of it pointed to a premeditated conspiracy to murder me legally and financially, even if I survived physically. The most heartbreaking revelation came when investigators discovered that Michael and Jessica had been romantically involved for over 2 years before my accident. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, and testimony from witnesses painted a picture of a long-term affair that had been carefully hidden from me and everyone else in our social circle. They had been planning a life together, but my assets and the complications of divorce had stood in their way. I owned the house. I had the life insurance policy. I had the inheritance from my grandmother and the investment portfolio we'd built during our marriage. A divorce would have left Michael with a fraction of what he felt entitled to, especially if evidence of his affair came to light. My death, on the other hand, would leave him with everything. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Create circumstances that would lead me to drive alone in dangerous conditions. Arrange for Jessica to be in position at the hospital to influence my medical care and documentation. Use her medical knowledge to create plausible scenarios for my deterioration and death. File the necessary legal paperwork to make the death official. Collect the insurance money and sell the assets. Wait a respectful period of time before beginning their new life together. The only thing they hadn't counted on was my recovery. As I sat in that rehabilitation center, learning to walk again while investigators unraveled the full scope of the betrayal, I realized that the two people I had loved most in the world had spent over 2 years planning my murder. Not a crime of passion, not a mistake born of desperation, but a calculated plot to steal my life in every possible way. They had succeeded for 18 months. While I lay unconscious, they had erased my existence, divided my assets, and built a new life together on the foundation of my supposed death. They had been living in a house purchased with my insurance money, wearing jewelry bought with proceeds from selling my grandmother's heirlooms, taking vacations funded by my liquidated investment accounts. Jessica had quit her job at Riverside General 6 months after my funeral, claiming that the trauma of losing her best friend had made it too difficult to continue working in healthcare. In reality, she no longer needed to work because they now had access to nearly $1 million in assets that had once belonged to me. Michael had expanded his real estate business, using my money to purchase rental properties and invest in commercial developments. He was now one of the most successful agents in Riverside, known for his keen business sense and his inspirational story of rebuilding his life after the tragic loss of his young wife. They had even established a scholarship fund in my memory at UC Riverside, making annual donations that enhanced their reputation as people who had turned their grief into positive action for others. The Sarah Thompson Memorial Scholarship for Marketing students had become a beloved tradition at the university, with Michael and Jessica attending the annual ceremony where they would speak movingly about my passion for helping young people achieve their dreams. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. As investigators dug deeper into the timeline of events, they uncovered evidence that my accident hadn't been an accident at all. Traffic camera footage from that night showed a vehicle following me for several miles before the collision, maintaining distance but clearly tracking my route. The vehicle matched the description of a car registered to one of Jessica's coworkers, though the license plates had been obscured by mud. Witnesses who had been too shaken to give detailed statements the night of the accident were re-interviewed by investigators. Several now remembered seeing a second vehicle at the scene, one that had left before emergency responders arrived. The driver had been wearing dark clothing and had quickly driven away without offering assistance or leaving contact information. Most damning of all was the discovery of Michael's location the night of my accident. Cell phone tower records showed that his phone had never been near the Morrison exit where he claimed to be stranded. Instead, he had been in the vicinity of our house all evening, his phone pinging towers that placed him within a few miles of our neighborhood. The timeline was damning. Michael's phone showed him leaving our area shortly before I received his call asking for rescue. Traffic cameras captured a vehicle matching his car's description traveling in the same direction. I would later take toward Highway 91, and witness statements now placed a car matching his at the accident scene. The investigators' theory was that Michael had called me from his car, not from a stranded location, and had then driven to a position where he could cause the collision while making it appear accidental. The storm provided perfect cover, obscuring visibility and making it difficult for witnesses to provide detailed descriptions of what they had seen. Jessica's role had been to ensure that if I survived the crash, she would be in position to control information about my condition and prognosis. Her medical expertise would allow her to manipulate documentation and provide false reports about my likelihood of recovery. If I had died in the accident, they would have collected the insurance money as grieving survivors If I survived but remained unconscious, they could declare me dead after an appropriate period and achieve the same financial outcome. The only scenario they hadn't fully prepared for was my complete recovery, which they had apparently considered. So unlikely that they hadn't developed contingency plans. Now, as I sat in Harbor View learning the full scope of their betrayal, I realized that they had been wrong about one thing. My recovery wasn't complete yet. Physically, I was growing stronger every day, regaining mobility and independence with the help of dedicated therapists who celebrated every small milestone. But emotionally and legally, I was just beginning the long journey back to reclaiming my life. The physical rehabilitation at Harbor View was grueling, but it paled in comparison to the emotional devastation of learning how completely my life had been dismantled while I lay unconscious. Every day brought new discoveries about what Michael and Jessica had stolen from me, and each revelation felt like another nail in the coffin of the person I used to be. My body had withered during 18 months of immobility. Muscles that had once carried me through weekend hiking trips and dance classes now struggled to support my weight for more than a few minutes at a time. My hands, which had once typed marketing proposals and painted watercolor landscapes, shook with fatigue after simple tasks like brushing my teeth or combing my hair. Dr. Martinez warned me that the recovery process would be measured in months, not weeks. Traumatic brain injury rehabilitation required patience and realistic expectations, he explained. Some patients recovered fully, others reached plateaus that became their new normal, and a few continued improving for years after their initial injury. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to the legal nightmare that awaited me. According to the state of California, Sarah Chen Thompson was dead. Her social security number was flagged as deceased. Her driver's license was invalid, her bank accounts were closed, and her credit history had been terminated. The woman sitting in the rehabilitation center might have Sarah's memories and Sarah's face, but legally speaking, she didn't exist. Attorney Robert Martinez, no relation to my doctor, despite sharing the same surname, had been recommended by Harbor View's Social Services Department. He specialized in cases involving identity theft and fraudulent death declarations, though he admitted that my situation was unlike anything he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. The challenge we're facing, he explained during our first meeting, is that proving you're alive is actually more complicated than it sounds. When someone has gone to such lengths to prove you're dead, we'll need to establish your identity through DNA testing, fingerprint analysis, and extensive documentation of your medical history and personal details that only the real Sarah Thompson would know. The DNA testing was straightforward enough. Amanda flew down from Seattle to provide a sample for comparison. She was so overwhelmed by the revelation that her sister was alive that she could barely speak coherently during our reunion. We spent hours crying together in my hospital room, with Amanda repeatedly apologizing for not questioning Michael's story more thoroughly and for not visiting the rehabilitation center to check on my condition herself. I trusted him completely, she sobbed. He seemed so broken by your death, so lost without you. When he said the doctors recommended against visitors because it would be too painful with no hope of recovery, I believed him. I thought I was respecting your wishes by letting you go peacefully. But Amanda's guilt was nothing compared to the rage that built in me as we worked through the legal process of resurrection. Every form we filed, every hearing we attended, every piece of documentation we provided felt like another humiliation inflicted by the two people who had supposedly loved me most. The insurance company was the first entity we had to confront, and their initial response was predictably hostile. Anthem Life Insurance had paid out $500,000 based on a death certificate and supporting medical documentation. Suggestion that their policyholder was actually alive and that they had been defrauded was met with skepticism and demands for extensive proof. Insurance fraud is a serious federal crime, their lead investigator Janet Morrison informed us. During a video conference from their corporate headquarters, if you're suggesting that Michael Thompson filed a fraudulent claim, you're alleging conspiracy, forgery, and mail fraud. We'll need irrefutable evidence before we consider reversing a claim of this magnitude. The bank was even less sympathetic. Wells Fargo had closed my accounts and distributed the funds, According to the legal documentation provided by my supposed widower, the house sale had been processed through their mortgage department, and they had facilitated the transfer of funds according to standard procedures for handling a deceased customer's estate. Mrs. Thompson, the bank's legal representative, explained. With barely concealed irritation, our records show that your accounts were properly closed following the presentation of a valid death certificate and probate documentation. If you're claiming those documents were fraudulent, you'll need to pursue that matter through law enforcement. We processed everything according to federal banking regulations. But it was the emotional toll of rebuilding my identity that proved most exhausting. Every institution I contacted required me to prove not just that I was alive, but that I was specifically Sarah Chen Thompson. The DMV wanted my old driver's license number, birth certificate, and proof of residence. My former employer needed verification of my social security number and employment history. My doctor's office required medical records and insurance information. The problem was that all of these documents had either been destroyed, altered, or were held by Michael as part of the estate settlement. I had to work backwards from memory, trying to reconstruct the paper trail of my existence, while investigators worked forward from the fraudulent documentation to prove how it had been falsified. The house on Maple Street was perhaps the most painful loss to confront. It had been my grandmother's home, the place where I'd spent childhood summers and holidays, where I'd brought Michael when we were first dating to introduce him to the most important place in my world. It represented 4 generations of my family's history in Riverside, and Michael had sold it to strangers as if it meant nothing. The new owners, David and Linda Chang, were understandably upset when investigators informed them that their property purchase might be invalidated due to fraud. They had bought the house in good faith, using their life savings for the down payment and taking out on a substantial mortgage to afford what they thought was their dream home. We're not wealthy people, Linda Chang explained tearfully when I met with them and their attorney. David works construction, and I'm a teacher. We saved for 8 years to buy this house. Children have their own bedrooms for the first time in their lives. If we lose this house, we lose everything we've worked for. Looking at their faces, seeing their children's toys scattered across the front yard where I used to plant flowers with my grandmother, I realized that Michael and Jessica's crime had created multiple victims. Chang's had done nothing wrong, but they were facing financial ruin because they had unknowingly purchased stolen property. Robert Martinez worked to negotiate a solution that would minimize the damage to the Chang family while still recovering my grandmother's house. The legal precedent was murky because cases of fraudulent property sales based on falsified death certificates were extremely rare. We would likely need to pursue civil litigation against Michael and Jessica to recover damages, then use those funds to compensate the Changs for their losses. But even if we succeeded in court, the house itself was gone. The Changs had already made modifications, painted over my grandmother's original wall colors, and replaced fixtures that held decades of family memories. Even if I could legally reclaim the property, it would never again be the sanctuary where my grandmother had taught me to bake apple pies and where I had dreamed of raising my own children someday. My former job at Davidson Marketing proved equally complicated to address. The company had processed my termination according to their bereavement policies, collected life insurance benefits from the group policy they maintained on employees, and donated my personal office items to charity after holding them for the standard 6-month period. Sarah was such a valued member of our team, my former supervisor, Karen Wong, explained when she visited me at Harbor View. We were all devastated when Michael told us about your decline and eventual passing. The whole office attended your funeral. We established a memorial scholarship in your name at the local community college. Karen's genuine grief about my supposed death was touching, but it also highlighted how thoroughly Michael and Jessica had deceived everyone who cared about me. Dozens of people had mourned my loss, sent sympathy cards to Michael, and made charitable donations in my memory. They had all been unwitting participants in the lie that had stolen my life. The scholarship fund established in my memory created another ethical dilemma. 3 students had already received the Sarah Thompson Memorial Marketing Scholarship, using funds donated by people who believed they were honoring my memory. The scholarship recipients were innocent beneficiaries who had used the money for tuition and textbooks, never knowing that their assistance came from the proceeds of an elaborate fraud. My former colleagues at Davidson Marketing had contributed to the scholarship fund through payroll deduction, and several had made additional personal donations. They had organized annual fundraising events and memorial golf tournaments, with Michael serving as the honorary chairman, who spoke movingly about my passion for education and helping young people achieve their dreams. He was so inspiring, Karen recalled. Michael would talk about how you always believed in giving back to the community and how you would want your death to create opportunities for others. People were just blown away by how he was channeling his grief into something positive. But the most crushing discovery came when I learned about Jessica's role in maintaining the deception within our social circle. As my closest friend, she had become the unofficial keeper of my memory, organizing annual memorial gatherings and maintaining a shrine of photographs and mementos that she displayed in her apartment. Other friends would visit Jessica when they wanted to share memories of me or needed comfort on difficult anniversaries. She had positioned herself as the person who knew me best, who could speak most authoritatively about what I would have wanted and how I would have felt about various situations. Jessica had even written and published a blog called Letters to Sarah, where she shared weekly posts addressed to me, describing her daily life and asking my spirit for guidance with decisions. The blog had attracted thousands of followers, who were moved by her raw honesty about grief and her determination to keep my memory alive. Reading through 18 months of these fabricated letters was like being stabbed repeatedly with a poisoned knife. Jessica wrote about missing our coffee dates, about seeing movies she thought I would have enjoyed, about visiting our old college campus and feeling my presence in the places we had shared as students. I went to our favorite bookstore today. She had written in one post, "They still have that little corner where we used to sit and read for hours. I picked up the new romance novel you would have loved and read the first chapter out loud, pretending you were there listening to me. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I could feel you smiling." The comments on these posts revealed how completely Jessica had convinced everyone of her genuine grief. Mutual friends would write about how inspiring Jessica was, how beautifully she was honoring my memory, and how lucky I had been to have such a devoted friend who refused to let death end our relationship. "Jessica, you are such an amazing person," one commenter had written. "Sarah is so blessed to have had a friend like you. The way you keep her spirit alive through these letters gives me chills. I know she's watching over you and Michael, and she must be so grateful for how you're taking care of each other." Taking care of each other. The phrase made me physically ill because I now understood what it really meant. While Jessica was writing touching blog posts about missing her dead best friend, she was sleeping in my bed with my husband, wearing my grandmother's jewelry, and spending my life insurance money on vacations to places Michael and I had planned to visit together. The social media documentation of their relationship revealed the calculated nature of their public performance. For the first 6 months after my supposed death, their interactions online were limited to grief support and mutual consolation. Jessica would post memories of our friendship, and Michael would respond with gratitude for her help in preserving my legacy. But gradually their online relationship evolved. Jessica began posting photographs of herself with Michael at grief, counseling sessions, at memorial events, and eventually at social gatherings where they were supporting each other through their shared loss. The progression from grieving friends to romantic partners was so gradual and seemingly natural that their social circle embraced the relationship as a beautiful example of love emerging from tragedy. It's so wonderful to see Michael and Jessica finding happiness together. One mutual friend had commented on a photo of them at a charity gala. "Sarah would be so happy to know that the two people she loved most were able to comfort each other and build something beautiful from such a terrible loss." Their engagement announcement, posted exactly 1 year after my funeral, was met with an outpouring of support from friends who saw their union as the ultimate tribute to my memory. The post featured a photograph of Michael proposing to Jessica at my gravesite, with the caption explaining that he had asked my permission before proposing and that Jessica had felt my blessing as she accepted. "Sarah will always be the love of my life," Michael had written in the engagement post. "But I know she would want me to be happy, and she would want Jessica to be loved by someone who understands how special she is. We're not replacing what we lost, but we're building something new that honors the love Sarah taught us to share. The wedding had been small and intimate, held at the same church where Michael and I had been married 3 years earlier. Jessica had worn my grandmother's pearl necklace, claiming that she felt my presence blessing their union.
Oh, Michael had
given a toast about how grief had taught him to appreciate every moment of happiness and how he knew I was watching over them from heaven. Their honeymoon photos from Hawaii showed them visiting romantic beaches and luxury resorts, all funded by my life insurance money. They had stayed in the same hotel where Michael and I had spent our honeymoon, even requesting the same suite because Michael said it felt like bringing my memory along on their new beginning. But perhaps the most devastating part of learning about their new life together was discovering how they had divided my personal possessions. Jessica was wearing my clothes, using my kitchen appliances, and displaying my artwork in their apartment. She had even taken my college diploma and hung it next to hers, claiming that it made her feel closer to my spirit.
Michael
Had kept my car, telling people that driving it made him feel connected to my memory. He had given some of my jewelry to his mother as keepsakes, sold other pieces to fund their lifestyle, and had even gifted some of my designer handbags to Jessica as anniversary presents, claiming that I would have wanted my best friend to enjoy them. My grandmother's antique furniture, which had been in our family for generations, was now scattered throughout their apartment and had been sold to vintage dealers. The rocking chair where my grandmother had read me stories as a child was gone, replaced by modern furniture that Jessica had selected to create their new life together. The physical therapy at Harborview became my refuge from these daily revelations of loss. Working with the therapist to rebuild my strength gave me concrete goals that distracted from the overwhelming nature of reclaiming my stolen life. Every small improvement in my mobility or coordination felt like a victory against the people who had tried to erase me from existence. But even my recovery process was tainted by Michael and Jessica's deception. My medical insurance had been terminated after my death certificate was filed, leaving Harborview unable to collect payment for the extensive rehabilitation services I was receiving. The facility was absorbing the cost of my care while investigators worked to resolve my legal status, but the financial strain was significant. Dr. Martinez and the rehabilitation staff never made me feel like a burden, but I was acutely aware that my resurrection was creating financial hardship for the institution that had saved my life. Every therapy session, every medical test, every day of room and board was adding to a debt that I had no legal means to address, because the person responsible for the debt was officially dead. The psychological counseling that Harborview provided was essential for processing the trauma of learning about the conspiracy, but it was also a constant reminder of how completely my support system had been destroyed. The counselor, Dr. Patricia Reynolds, specialized in helping patients adjust to life after traumatic brain injury. But she had never worked with someone whose trauma was compounded by discovering that their entire life had been stolen. "You're experiencing is a unique form of psychological abuse," Dr. Reynolds explained during one of our sessions. "You're grieving not just the 18 months you lost while unconscious, but also the life you had before the accident, the relationships you believed were genuine, and the future you had planned with people who betrayed you." The grief was complicated by the fact that I couldn't simply cut Michael and Jessica out of my life and move on. They'd committed crimes that required legal prosecution, and I was the primary witness whose testimony would be essential for achieving justice. This meant that instead of healing through distance and time, I would need to relive the betrayal repeatedly through investigations, depositions, and eventually trial testimony. Amanda tried to be supportive, but she was struggling with her own guilt about believing Michael's story and not questioning his decisions about my care. She had taken leave from her job in Seattle to help coordinate my legal and medical needs, but the stress was affecting her relationship with her fiancé and her performance at work. "I keep thinking about all the times I could have visited you," she said during one of our conversations. "If I had driven down here even once to check on you myself, I would have discovered that you weren't actually dying. You would have been rescued months earlier, and Michael and Jessica wouldn't have had time to steal so much from you." But the reality was that even if Amanda had discovered the truth earlier, reversing the damage would still have been complicated. Michael and Jessica had moved quickly to liquidate assets and establish legal precedents that supported their story. The insurance money had been spent, the house had been sold, and my possessions had been scattered or destroyed. As my physical strength gradually returned and my legal status slowly moved toward resolution, I realized that recovery meant more than regaining my health and reclaiming my identity. It meant accepting that the person I had been before the accident was gone forever, just as surely as if I had actually died that night on Highway 91. The naive woman who had trusted her husband completely and shared every secret with her best friend no longer existed. The person learning to walk again in a Monterey rehabilitation center was someone harder, warier, and more alone in the world than Sarah Thompson had ever imagined possible. But she was also someone who understood exactly how much Michael and Jessica had stolen. She was developing a very clear plan for making them pay for every single thing they had taken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.